Filiberto Esposito didn't believe in fear, but standing in his Milan penthouse at 3 a.m. with blood still wet on his gold Rolex, he wondered if the woman blocking his path might teach him what it meant. Alessia Falassi pressed her finger to her lips with desperate urgency. Don't let her hear you, Signore. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't miss them. Now, let's go back 2 hours before, where it all started. In Filiberto's world, people didn't give him commands. He gave orders that toppled empires and maintained a fragile peace between Italy's most vicious crime families. Yet something in the housekeeper's caramel eyes, terror woven with unshakable determination, made him freeze mid-step. What the hell is happening in my house? His voice came out deadly low, the kind of quiet that preceded bloodshed. Alessia grabbed his tattooed arm with surprising strength, pulling him toward the shadows near the bedroom hallway. If you go in there now, it will only get worse for her. His daughter, Leah, his 6-year-old Stelina, was supposed to be sleeping peacefully beneath her canopy bed, surrounded by teddy bears and innocence. He'd spent the evening handling business at the port, the kind that left men broken and silent. He'd come home early for once, carrying guilt heavier than the Beretta concealed at his ribs. From deeper in the penthouse, he heard it. A child's voice, trembling, not asleep, not safe. Alessia's hand moved toward his mouth in warning. She'll hear you. Trust me. 60 seconds, Signore. No one called him Signore with such raw honesty. Not his soldiers, not his business partners. Not even Amina, his fiancée, who preferred Tesoro when she wanted to manipulate him. But Alessia said it like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, like a prayer whispered in a burning church. They moved through shadows he knew intimately, past the grand furniture and marble columns that screamed wealth and power. As they approached Lee's bedroom doorway, Alessia positioned him at an angle where the hallway light wouldn't betray his imposing frame. Then she pointed through the partially open door. Filiberto saw his daughter sitting on the floor between 2 white cushioned chairs, small shoulders curved inward, arms wrapped protectively around her knees. And towering over her, pacing like a predator in burgundy silk and black stiletto heels, was Amina Lorenzo, his fiancée, the daughter of Carlo Lorenzo. Their engagement was a treaty between warring families, signed in expensive wine and sealed with promises neither intended to keep. You think tears will change anything, Leah? Amina's voice sliced through the air like a blade through silk. Your father isn't here. He's never here. And when he is, he's too consumed by his precious empire to notice what happens in his own home. Filiberto's vision blurred red. His tattooed hands clenched into fists. Weak children become liabilities, Amina continued, her disheveled blonde hair catching the soft bedroom light as she crouched to the child's eye level. In my family, we eliminate liabilities before they become problems. Be grateful I'm only teaching you the truth. She tilted Lee's chin upward with one sharp fingernail. Tell me what you are. Lee's tiny voice whispered through tears. Nothing. The word detonated in Filiberto's chest like a grenade in an enclosed space. Everything he'd built, every territory claimed, every rival crushed, every fortune amassed, all of it meant absolutely nothing if his own daughter believed she was nothing. If you're listening to this and feel that the story touches something quiet and unspoken inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video, so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every single day. And if it is not too much to ask, tell me where you are watching from, and leave a comment below so we know which corner of the world this story has reached, because we treasure every word you share with us. Filiberto lunged forward. The killer's instinct surged through his veins like molten steel. He would wrap his tattooed hand around Amina's throat and squeeze until her cruel voice silenced forever. But Alessia stopped him with strength impossible for a woman of such slender frame. She pushed him back against the wall, her entire body pressing against his massive chest to hold him in place. Her traditional maid's uniform a stark contrast to the violence radiating from his powerful body. "Not yet," she whispered, her voice cutting like a scalpel through infected flesh. "If you go in there now, she will twist everything around. You will become the monster in her story. She will threaten to walk away and take the Lorenzo alliance with her, and you know your associates will question your judgment. You know this game, Signore." Filiberto knew. He knew it with brutal, crushing clarity. The engagement to Amina was never about love or even desire. It was a peace treaty written in blood money and territorial agreements, bound by tradition and enforced by mutual benefit. But his child, his own flesh and blood, was sitting on that floor believing she was nothing, and every second he stood here, doing nothing, made him complicit. Alessia pulled a small recording device from her uniform pocket, the screen glowing in the darkness like a beacon of hope. "You need to see this before you do anything." She pressed play. The video appeared, filmed from above, perhaps from a hidden camera in the decorative shelf above the bed. Filiberto recognized his daughter's bedroom. The soft pink walls he'd personally chosen, the canopy bed he'd assembled himself in a rare moment of fatherly devotion. And he recognized Leah, his baby girl, being dragged by her thin arm across the carpet by Amina. The child made no sound, no crying, no screaming. Only teeth clenched in silent endurance, like a prisoner who had learned that resistance only invited more pain. The next video showed Leah sitting in the corner of her playroom, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. Amina walked over in her burgundy silk blouse and black pencil skirt, looking every inch the powerful woman accustomed to getting what she wanted. Without warning, without hesitation, her hand swung down and struck the 6-year-old girl across the face. The slap echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Leah stumbled sideways, but did not dare cry out loud, only pressed her small hand to her reddened cheek. Then Amina's voice rang out in the recording, cold and vicious enough to freeze blood in veins. "Your mother was pathetic too. That's why she's gone. Your father replaced her easily enough with me. He'll replace you just as fast if you become more trouble than you're worth." The screen went dark. Filiberto stood frozen, his imposing frame trembling with a rage so pure and absolute it transcended mere violence. This woman, this serpent he'd brought into his sanctuary, into his daughter's life, had been systematically destroying the only innocent thing left in his corrupted world. The blood on his hands from tonight's business at the port was nothing compared to the blood Amina had drawn from his child's spirit. Alessia's voice came soft but unwavering. "I've been documenting everything for 3 weeks, Signore. Since the first day I started working here. I knew something was terribly wrong the moment I saw how that little girl flinched when Signorina Lorenzo entered the room. She met his intense dark eyes without fear, her caramel skin glowing in the dim hallway light. I was a caregiver before this position. I recognize abuse when I see it, and I recognize a father who doesn't know it's happening under his own roof. Why didn't you tell me immediately?" Filiberto's voice cracked, something that hadn't happened since childhood. "Would you have believed a maid you hired 3 weeks ago over the woman you were supposed to marry?" Alessia's gaze held his. "Or would you have fired me to preserve the peace, to protect the alliance, to maintain the empire?" The truth of her words cut deeper than any knife he'd ever wielded. He would have dismissed her concerns. He would have chosen the treaty, the power structure, the carefully balanced criminal ecosystem. He would have sacrificed his daughter's safety on the altar of his ambition. "What do I do?" The words felt foreign on his tongue, bitter and unfamiliar. Filiberto Esposito didn't ask for guidance. He gave orders and watched men scramble to obey. But standing in the shadows of his own home, watching his child suffer, he realized he'd been leading himself toward catastrophe. "You finish watching," Alessia said quietly, her traditional maid's uniform with its white collar and apron somehow lending her an authority his expensive navy suit couldn't match. "And you let her confess everything. She feels safe enough to reveal her true nature when she thinks you're not here. We need her own words, her own voice to bury her completely." They stood in the darkness, Alessia's slender frame beside his massive, tattooed presence, and Filiberto forced himself to witness what his emotional absence had created. Amina continued her psychological torture, her burgundy blouse catching the lamplight as she paced around the trembling child like a shark circling wounded prey. "Do you know why your father keeps me around, Piccola?" Amina's voice dripped with contempt. "It's not love. It's not even desire. It's because my surname opens doors his tattoos and threats cannot. I am his key to legitimacy, to acceptance in circles that still view him as street trash with expensive suits." She laughed, the sound cold and brittle. "And you? You're just the inconvenient reminder of the woman who wasn't strong enough to survive in his violent world." "My mama was strong," Leah whispered, the first spark of defiance in her small voice cutting through her fear. Amina's hand shot out, gripping the child's delicate chin hard enough to leave marks. "Your mama was weak enough to die and leave you alone with a father who values power over family. I'll tolerate you because I have no choice. Eliminating you would jeopardize my position. But make no mistake, the moment you become more trouble than you're worth, I'll convince him to send you away. Military academy. Boarding school in Switzerland. Anywhere I don't have to see your pathetic face reminding me of your pathetic mother." The recording device in Alessia's hand captured every word, every cruel confession, every piece of evidence needed to destroy Amina's credibility and power forever. Filiberto felt something fundamental break inside him. Not his rage, which burned hotter than ever, but the carefully constructed wall he'd built between his criminal life and his role as a father. He'd told himself that keeping them separate kept Leah safe, that his absence protected her from his darkness. But his absence had created a vacuum, and monsters like Amina had filled it eagerly, hungrily. "Enough," he whispered to Alessia, his voice barely audible. "I have everything I need." Alessia nodded once and stepped back, melting into the shadows like smoke. Filiberto Esposito stepped into the light, his imposing frame filling the bedroom doorway, his navy suit jacket catching the glow from the nightstand lamps. His intricate tattoo sleeves were visible where his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar and wrists, marking him as a man who'd risen from violence to power. His strong jawline was set, his intense dark eyes colder than winter in the Alps. The transformation was instant, from hidden observer to the apex predator he truly was. Amina's head snapped toward him, her disheveled blonde hair whipping around, her sharp features cycling rapidly through surprise, calculation, and finally settling on a practiced smile. "Tesoro, you're home early. Shut your mouth." His voice was glacier ice and buried secrets. "Don't say another word unless I ask you a direct question." Lee's eyes went wide, red-rimmed from crying, and she scrambled to her feet in her cream-colored sweater and beige pants, confusion and desperate hope warring on her tear-stained face. "Papa, come here, Stellina." He used his pet name for her, Little Star, the one he'd given her when she was born. Leah ran to him, and he scooped her up with one tattooed arm, holding her small body against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering like war drums. With his free hand, he pulled out his phone, his gold Rolex catching the light. Amina's practiced smile faltered, cracks appearing in her composed facade. "Filiberto, if this is about discipline methods." I said shut your mouth. He pressed play on the video Alessia had transferred to his device. Amina's voice filled the room, cold and unmistakable. "I'll tolerate you because I have no choice. Eliminating you would jeopardize my position. But make no mistake, the moment you become more trouble than you're worth, I'll convince him to send you away." The color drained from Amina's fair skin. Her carefully maintained composure shattered like expensive crystal hitting marble. You don't understand the full context." "The context," Filiberto said softly, each word measured and deadly, "is that you have been systematically abusing my daughter in my own home while I was out building an empire I thought would protect her." He set Leah down gently behind him, positioning his powerful body between her and Amina. "The context is that I have 3 weeks of high-definition footage showing exactly what kind of monster wears designer silk and calls it discipline." Amina's expression hardened as her last mask dropped away, revealing the calculating predator beneath. Her burgundy blouse seemed to darken, matching the blood-red rage in her eyes. You need me. My family's alliance with yours is worth exactly nothing compared to my daughter's well-being. Filiberto pulled out his phone again, already dialing. Enzo, come to the penthouse. Bring Marco and Dante. We're escorting Signorina Lorenzo off the premises permanently, and have someone contact her father. He'll want to collect his daughter before sunrise. You're making a catastrophic mistake. Amina hissed, her professional demeanor completely abandoned now, her true nature fully exposed. My father will. Your father will receive a complete copy of these recordings within the hour, along with my formal withdrawal from our engagement. Filiberto's smile was the kind that made hardened criminals confess their darkest sins. I'm certain Carlo will understand that I cannot marry a woman who believes child abuse is acceptable behavior. Unless, of course, he wants every family in our network to see exactly what his daughter does behind closed doors. The threat landed with devastating precision. Carlo Lorenzo's reputation was built on old-world honor codes and family values. The revelation that his daughter tortured innocent children would obliterate any respect or fear he commanded in their world. Within minutes, Enzo and his men arrived. Three imposing figures in dark suits who looked like they'd stepped from Filiberto's same violent world. They escorted a seething, silent Amina from the penthouse, her black stiletto heels clicking against marble for the last time, her burgundy silk blouse a fading memory of danger averted. When the heavy door closed with final authority, Filiberto turned to find Alessia standing quietly near the hallway, maintaining her professional distance despite everything that had transpired. But her caramel eyes held fierce satisfaction, and her traditional maid's uniform somehow seemed like armor now, proof that true strength didn't require violence or intimidation. The rest of the staff, Filiberto said quietly, running a tattooed hand through his slick-back hair, exhaustion and rage warring in his dark eyes. They knew. They saw what was happening. They said nothing. Alessia nodded, her black hair still perfectly pulled back in its low bun despite the night's intensity. Fear of Signorina Lorenzo or loyalty to her family name. Either way, they failed Leah when she needed protection most. They're gone. All of them. By morning. He looked at the South Asian woman who'd risked everything to protect his child. Except you. Signore, you protected my daughter when I failed to. His voice cracked again, a vulnerability he would only allow in front of this woman who had proven herself more loyal than soldiers he'd known for decades. You risked your position, possibly your life, to document the truth and force me to see it. That kind of courage is rare in any world, but especially in mine. Alessia met his intense gaze without flinching. I did it because it was right, not because I expected reward or recognition. I know. Filiberto looked at his daughter, who stood watching them with wide, uncertain eyes, her cream sweater making her look impossibly small and fragile. Which is exactly why you're the only person I trust near her now. He crossed to Leah, his imposing frame and expensive navy suit a stark contrast to her innocent appearance. He knelt before her, so they were eye level, his massive tattooed hands looking enormous as they gently cupped her small, pale face. I'm sorry, Stellina. I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening. But I promise you, I swear to you on everything I am, that changes now. You're not going to send me away. Lee's voice was so small, so fragile, echoing Amina's cruel threats. Never. The word was an unbreakable oath. You are my daughter, my blood, my family, and family is the only empire that truly matters. Leah threw her arms around his neck, and Filiberto Esposito, this powerful man who commanded fear across continents, whose tattooed arms had broken rivals and built criminal empires, broke completely, shattered by the trust of one small child who still believed he could protect her. Over Lee's shoulder, his eyes met Alessia's. She nodded once, a silent promise to guard what he'd almost lost forever. Weeks later, the Milan penthouse had transformed from fortress to home. The cold marble and imposing architecture remained, but Lee's crayon drawings now decorated the refrigerator door. Her favorite storybooks lay scattered across the expensive coffee table. The grand piano that once served as a hiding spot now played children's songs badly, as Filiberto attempted to learn them for her. Filiberto's business meetings happened exclusively at his downtown office now, never in the space where Leah lived and played and healed. The soldiers who once filled his living room with tension were replaced by the sound of his daughter's laughter, once so rare, now beautifully common. Alessia had been given her own quarters in the penthouse, no longer merely a housekeeper, but Lee's official caregiver and the one person Filiberto trusted without reservation. She'd become the steady presence that anchored their healing, the moral compass that guided his transformation. Filiberto sat at the breakfast table, something he'd never done before that terrible 3 a.m. awakening, watching Leah explain her latest crayon masterpiece to Alessia. His daughter's laughter filled the space like music, like redemption. "Papa, do you like it?" Leah held up a picture of 3 figures. A tall man covered in colorful scribbles representing his tattoos, a little girl in the middle, and a woman with dark hair, wearing what looked like a traditional maid's uniform. "It's perfect, Stellina," and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Alessia caught his eye over Lee's head, and something passed between them. Understanding forged in crisis, respect earned through courage, and the beginning of something neither had expected. She'd saved his daughter from a monster. She'd saved him from becoming the kind of man who valued power over family. The alliance with the Lorenzo family had fractured completely, but Filiberto discovered he didn't need it. His reputation for protecting his own, for valuing his daughter above political maneuvering and criminal partnerships, had earned him a different kind of respect in their brutal world. The kind that couldn't be threatened, bought, or destroyed. He learned that being a boss meant nothing if he failed at being a father. And as he watched Alessia help Leah sound out words in her storybook, her patient voice and gentle manner a stark contrast to Amina's cruelty, he realized that sometimes the most powerful decision a man can make is admitting he needs help, and accepting it with gratitude from the brave woman who offered it when everyone else remained silent. The criminal empire could wait. His daughter couldn't. And that single truth made all the difference between the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. Alessia's grip on his arm remained firm, grounding him in the present even as rage threatened to pull him under. She guided him deeper into the shadow of the corridor, away from the sliver of light spilling from Lee's room, where his daughter's muffled whimpers still echoed like accusations. "Listen to me carefully," Alessia whispered, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who'd navigated countless crises. "You cannot storm in there. Not yet." Filiberto's jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to act, to end this. But something in Alessia's steady gaze, a clarity he rarely encountered in his world of calculated lies and strategic alliances, made him pause. "She's been doing this for months," Alessia continued, her words measured but urgent. "Every time you leave for business, every late meeting, every overnight trip, Amina waits until the house is quiet, until she's certain you're gone, and then she goes to Lee's room." The words landed like physical blows. Months. This had been happening for months, while he'd been building empires and crushing rivals, blind to the war being waged under his own roof. "Why didn't anyone?" he started, but Alessia cut him off. "Because they're terrified of her, of you, of losing their positions." Her expression hardened. "I came to this house 6 weeks ago as a temporary nurse when Leah had that fever. You remember? I stayed because—" She paused, something fierce flickering in her eyes, "because I recognized what was happening. I've seen it before in other wealthy homes. The powerful woman who resents the child. The staff who look away because their mortgages depend on silence." Filiberto's hands curled into fists. He wanted to rage at the injustice of it, at the cowardice, but Alessia pressed on. "I started documenting everything. Times, dates, what was said." She reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small recording device, no larger than a lipstick. "I placed this in Lee's room 3 days ago, hidden in the bookshelf behind her stuffed bear. Amina doesn't know it's there." He stared at the device, this tiny piece of technology that held the truth he'd been too absent to see. You recorded her? I had to. In your world, Mr. Caruso, accusations without proof are just noise. And Amina, Alessia's voice dropped even lower. She's not just cruel. She's calculated. She never leaves marks, never loses control in front of witnesses. If you confront her without evidence, she'll deny everything. She'll twist it, make Leah seem like a difficult child, make me seem like a disgruntled employee trying to cause trouble. The strategic assessment was painfully accurate. It was exactly how he would have handled an accusation in his business. Deny, deflect, destroy credibility. The realization that Amina operated with the same ruthless intelligence he'd once admired in her made his stomach turn. "Show me," he said, his voice barely audible. Alessia hesitated. "It's not easy to hear." "Show me." She tapped the device, and his daughter's voice filled the narrow space between them. Small, frightened, pleading. "Please, I'll be good. I promise I'll be quieter." Then Amina's voice, sharp as a blade. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to play mother to some man's orphan baggage? You're nothing but an obstacle, a constant reminder that he had a life before me." Filiberto's vision blurred at the edges. His hand moved instinctively toward the gun concealed beneath his jacket, but Alessia's hand shot out, pressing against his chest. "Not yet," she said firmly. "If you act on rage alone, she'll use it against you. She'll call it abuse, paint herself as the victim. With her family's connections, she could make your life hell. Could even question your custody, your fitness as a father." The tactical assessment cut through his fury like ice water. She was right. Amina's family had judges, politicians, media connections. A messy, violent confrontation would give them ammunition. "So what do you suggest?" The question came out harder than he intended, but Alessia didn't flinch. "We let her finish tonight. We record everything. Her words, her intentions, her complete disregard for Lee's well-being. Then you confront her with irrefutable proof. No room for spin, no space for lies." She met his eyes directly. "You're a powerful man, Mr. Caruso. Use that power intelligently, not just forcefully." Another whimper from Lee's room made his entire body tense. Waiting felt like betrayal, like choosing strategy over his daughter's immediate safety. But Alessia seemed to read his thoughts. "I won't let her hurt Leah. Not physically. If she crosses that line, I'll intervene immediately. But what we need is her confession, her true feelings on record. That's the weapon that will destroy her permanently, that will ensure she never has access to Leah again." Filiberto looked at this woman, this temporary nurse who'd been in his home for barely 6 weeks, and recognized something he rarely encountered: genuine moral courage. Not the bravado of his soldiers or the calculated loyalty of his associates, but the quiet strength of someone who'd chosen to stand in harm's way for a child who wasn't even her own. "After this is over," he said quietly, "whatever you want. Name it." Alessia shook her head. "I don't want payment. I want you to be the father she needs. That's all." From Lee's room, Amina's voice rose again, cold and contemptuous. "Stop that pathetic crying. You sound exactly like your mother probably did. Weak and useless." Filiberto's control nearly shattered, but Alessia's hand on his arm anchored him. She positioned him carefully at the doorway's edge, where the angle of the wall would keep him hidden but allow him to see and hear everything. "Record it all," she whispered. "Every word, every moment. And when she's finished, when we have everything we need, then you show her exactly who Filiberto Caruso really is." The recording device felt weightless in his palm, but the responsibility it carried was enormous. For once in his life, patience wasn't weakness. It was the most powerful weapon he possessed, and he would wield it with devastating precision. But standing in that darkness, listening to his daughter's broken sobs, Filiberto discovered that precision required something he'd never truly mastered: stillness. The shadows pressed against him like physical weight. His back against the cold wall, his breathing controlled the silence. He remained hidden just beyond the doorframe's edge. From this angle, he could see into Lee's room, the soft glow of her nightlight casting everything in amber, the small figure curled on her bed, and Amina standing over her like a burgundy-clad executioner. Every muscle in his body screamed for action. He'd built his empire on decisive movement, on striking first and fastest. Hesitation meant weakness. Delay meant death. Yet here he stood, forced into paralysis by strategy, by the cruel mathematics of power that demanded he witness more before he could act. Amina's voice drifted out again, measured and poisonous. Your father doesn't care about you, you know. If he did, he'd be here. But he's not, is he? He's never here. The words found their mark. Not in Leah, but in him. Filiberto's hands clenched until his knuckles went white. The recording device bit into his palm, a small piece of technology that felt utterly inadequate against the enormity of his failure. Because Amina wasn't wrong. She was cruel, manipulative, monstrous, but she wasn't wrong. He hadn't been here. The cold fury that had burned so bright just moments ago began to turn inward, a corrosive acid eating through the armor he'd worn for years. How many late meetings had he prioritized? How many business dinners had stretched into the early hours? How many times had he kissed Lee's forehead as she slept and told himself that providing for her, protecting her from the outside world, was enough? He'd eliminated men for lesser offenses than what Amina was inflicting. 3 weeks ago, he'd authorized a hit on a rival who'd threatened his territory. The man had left behind a wife, maybe children. Filiberto had rationalized it as business, as survival, as the natural order of their world. The blood had washed off his hands easily enough. It always did. But this horror unfolding in his daughter's bedroom, this was his doing. Not Amina's alone, but his. Please, Leah whispered, her voice so small it barely carried. Please, I just want my papa. The sound nearly shattered him. His hand moved involuntarily toward the doorframe, his entire body coiling to surge forward, but Alessia's presence beside him was a physical reminder. Not yet. The recording wasn't complete. Strategic patience. Intelligent power. All the justifications felt like cowardice. He'd killed men for money, for territory, for respect, for the abstract concept of honor within a dishonorable world. He'd justified every act of violence as necessary, as the price of the life he'd chosen. He'd told himself that his ruthlessness protected those he loved, that his fearsome reputation was a shield around his family. What good was being feared if the people in his own home suffered? What did his power mean if it couldn't protect a 6-year-old girl from psychological torture? The blood on his hands, and there was plenty of it, had never haunted him. He'd slept soundly after ordering executions, had eaten dinner after watching men beg for their lives. Those were professional decisions, clean in their own brutal way. Men who lived by violence understood the risks. They knew the game. They made their choices. Leah had made no choices. She was innocent, and the wounds being inflicted on her now couldn't be washed away with water or rationalized with business logic. You're pathetic, Amina continued, pacing slowly around the bed, crying over nothing. Do you know how lucky you are? And still you snivel like some abandoned street rat. Filiberto closed his eyes against the rage. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the truth with devastating clarity. He'd been absent not just physically, but emotionally. He'd used his dangerous life as an excuse to remain distant, to keep his daughter at arm's length where she couldn't see the blood, couldn't know the things he'd done. He'd told himself it was protection. It had been abandonment. The violence he'd committed had consequences, yes, but they were consequences he'd accepted. Rival gangs retaliated, authorities investigated, enemies plotted revenge. These were all part of the equation, risks he'd calculated and deemed acceptable. But he'd never calculated this risk. He'd never considered that his absence would create a different kind of danger, one that couldn't be solved with guns or threats or money. He'd fortified his penthouse against external enemies and left it completely vulnerable to the predator he'd invited inside. He'd chosen Amina carefully, or so he'd thought. Beautiful, intelligent, from a respected family. Someone who could navigate his world's complexities, who understood power and discretion. Someone who seemed genuinely fond of Leah during their courtship, patient and warm. He'd been blind. willfully, criminally blind. Because he'd been looking for a partner in his empire, not a mother for his daughter. He'd been thinking about alliances and appearances, about how Amina's family connections could benefit his operations. He'd seen what he wanted to see and ignored every sign that didn't fit his narrative. Alessia had been here 6 weeks and had seen the truth immediately. His own staff had known for months. Only he, the man who prided himself on reading people, on spotting deception and weakness, had remained oblivious. Or had he? The thought arrived like a blade between his ribs. Had he truly been oblivious? Or had he simply been too occupied to care? Too consumed with his empire to notice the smaller empire crumbling at home? Your mother was weak too, Amina said, and Filiberto's eyes snapped open. She couldn't handle your father's world, could she? Probably why she's dead. Weak women don't survive in this life. Lee's mother, his late wife, had been the opposite of weak. She'd been fierce, loving, uncompromising in her morals, even as she'd chosen to love a man steeped in blood. She'd made him promise, on her deathbed, that he'd protect their daughter from his world, that he'd give Leah a chance at normalcy, at safety, at innocence. He'd broken that promise spectacularly, not by exposing Leah to his criminal life, but by abandoning her to face cruelty alone. He'd thought keeping his two worlds separate was protection. He'd been wrong about everything. A rival's bullet had taken his wife 3 years ago. Collateral damage in a war he'd started over territory disputes. He'd avenged her death brutally, systematically dismantling the organization responsible. He'd told himself it was justice, that the blood he'd spilled balanced the scales somehow. But standing here now, he understood that no amount of vengeance had brought her back. No amount of violence had healed the wound her death had left in Lee's life. He'd been so focused on punishing the world for taking his wife that he'd failed to see his daughter needed a parent, not an avenger. The guilt crashed over him in waves. Every business trip that had run long. Every phone call he'd taken instead of reading bedtime stories. Every night he'd come home after Leah was asleep, telling himself that tomorrow he'd spend more time with her. Tomorrow had never come. And in his absence, this nightmare had taken root. Stop crying, Amina snapped. God, you're exhausting. Do you think I enjoy wasting my time on you? I have actual responsibilities, actual importance. But instead, I'm stuck babysitting a reminder of your father's past. Filiberto's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. The recording device in his palm was accumulating evidence, yes, but it was also accumulating his failures. Every word Amina spoke was an indictment not just of her cruelty, but of his negligence. Alessia touched his arm gently, a silent reminder to breathe, to wait, to hold. Her presence was the only thing keeping him from exploding into that room and ending this with his bare hands. He'd ordered men killed for disrespect, for betrayal, for threatening what was his. The violence had always been purposeful, strategic, justified within his moral framework. But now he understood that all that blood, all that power, all that feared reputation meant nothing if he couldn't protect his own daughter from the monsters sleeping in his bed. The blood on his hands would wash away. He'd proven that 1,000 times. But the emotional wounds Amina had carved into Lee's heart, those scars would remain long after Amina was gone. Those would shape how his daughter understood love, trust, safety. Those wounds would define her in ways that no physical violence ever could. And that realization, that understanding of the different kinds of damage a person could inflict, changed something fundamental in Filiberto. The cold fury remained, but it was now directed at himself as much as at Amina. He was powerful. He was feared. He was ruthless. And he had failed at the only thing that actually mattered. The acknowledgement of his failure didn't bring peace. It brought a razor-sharp focus that cut through every other emotion. Alessia shifted beside him, adjusting their position so he had a clearer view into the room. The angle was deliberate. He could see everything now, but the wall's shadow kept him invisible. A perfect vantage point for surveillance. He'd used similar positions dozens of times before, watching targets, gathering intelligence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This time, He was watching his own life unravel. Amina moved through Lee's bedroom with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. Her burgundy silk robe caught the amber light as she paced, the color like dried blood against the soft pastels of the child's room. She dressed for comfort, for her nightly routine, never imagining an audience. That arrogance would be her undoing. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Amina commanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Lee's small frame trembled on the bed, her face buried in her hands. She was wearing pajamas printed with cartoon stars, a detail that made Filiberto's chest constrict. She was 6 years old. Just 6. I said, "Look at me." Amina's tone dropped to something more dangerous than shouting. It was the measured calm of absolute authority, the sound of someone who knew their power was unquestionable. Filiberto recognized that tone. He'd used it himself countless times. Hearing it directed at his daughter made him want to tear the world apart. Slowly, Leah lifted her head. Even from his hidden position, Filiberto could see her face was blotchy and wet with tears, her eyes red-rimmed and terrified. She looked at Amina the way people looked at him in his professional life, with fear that went bone deep. That look on his daughter's face was worse than any wound he'd ever taken. "That's better," Amina said, false sweetness creeping into her voice. "See? You can behave when you choose to. You just choose not to most of the time." "I'm sorry," Leah whispered, the words automatic, learned through repetition. "Sorry for what?" For being bad." Filiberto's hand moved instinctively toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. The familiar weight of the gun called to him, promising a simple solution. One bullet, one trigger pull, problem solved permanently. Alessia's hand caught his wrist immediately, her grip surprisingly strong. She didn't look at him, didn't make a sound, but her message was clear. Not yet. He wanted to shake her off. Every instinct screamed at him to end this, to step through that doorway and remove Amina from his daughter's life with the same efficiency he'd removed countless other threats. His fingers itched for the cold metal, for the familiar comfort of decisive action. But Alessia's presence was an anchor, and the recording device still sat in his other palm. Evidence. Strategy. The long game. He forced his hand away from the weapon, though the effort made his entire body shake with suppressed violence. "You're not bad, Leah," Amina said, and for a moment, she almost sounded kind. Then the mask dropped. "You're worse than bad. You're a burden. An obligation I never wanted but can't escape. Do you understand what that means?" Leah nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. "Say it. Tell me what you are." The child's voice was barely audible. "A burden." Louder. "A burden. And whose fault is that?" Lee's small shoulders hunched inward, as if she were trying to make herself disappear. "Mine." Filiberto's vision blurred at the edges. He'd seen men tortured. He'd witnessed interrogations designed to break the human spirit. He'd ordered psychological operations against enemies, knowing full well the lasting damage they would cause. But this, watching someone systematically destroy his daughter's sense of self-worth, her fundamental understanding of her own value, this was a cruelty he'd never imagined possible in his own home. His hand moved toward his weapon again, slower this time, but no less determined. The gun was a solution he understood. Clean. Final. Amina would never hurt Leah again if she simply ceased to exist. Alessia caught his wrist again, and this time she turned to look at him. In the dim light, her expression was clear. She understood the rage, understood the impulse, but she was asking him to trust her plan, to wait. Her head shook once, slowly, deliberately. Filiberto's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. Every fiber of his being was screaming at him to act, to protect, to eliminate the threat with the tools he knew best. Violence had always been his answer. It had always worked. But Alessia's eyes held his, steady and unwavering, reminding him that this required something different, something harder than pulling a trigger. He let his hand fall away from the weapon again, though it felt like ripping out his own heart. Amina circled Lee's bed like a predator considering its prey. You know what the worst part is? Your father actually believes you're special. He thinks you're this precious thing that needs protecting. She laughed, the sound hollow and cruel. But I see what you really are. Damaged goods. A broken little girl who will never amount to anything. Lee's whole body was shaking now, her small hands clutching the blanket as if it could protect her from the words. And do you want to know a secret? Amina leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried perfectly to where Filiberto stood. I'm going to marry your father. I'm going to have this last name, this life, this power. And you? You'll still be nothing but an afterthought. A mistake he's too proud to correct. The recording device in Filiberto's hand felt inadequate. This tiny piece of technology was supposed to be enough. These words, preserved digitally, were supposed to substitute for immediate justice. His hand drifted toward his weapon a third time, and this time the movement was unconscious. Pure instinct. His body knew how to solve problems like this. The solution was simple, elegant, permanent. Alessia's hand shot out again, but this time she held his wrist firmly, her thumb pressing against his pulse point. She could feel his heart racing, could sense how close he was to abandoning the plan entirely. She leaned closer, her whisper barely audible. This way, she never has access to Leah again. Your way, there are questions, investigations, custody battles, her family's lawyers. She paused, letting the words sink in. Finish this right, and your daughter is free. Finish this with violence, and you might lose her anyway. The logic cut through his rage like ice water. He'd been so focused on the immediate threat, on stopping Amina right now, that he hadn't thought about after. About the legal consequences of a body. About how Amina's powerful family would react. About how the authorities might question his fitness as a parent if his fiancée turned up dead. About how Leah might lose both her tormentor and her father in one night. His hand slowly moved away from the weapon. The effort required every ounce of self-control he possessed. That's better, Amina was saying to Leah, straightening up and adjusting her robe. Now, I expect you to be silent for the rest of the night. No more crying. No more pathetic little whimpers. If I hear one sound from this room, tomorrow will be much worse. Do you understand? Leah nodded frantically, her whole body rigid with fear. Good girl. The words were mocking, contemptuous. See? You can learn when you're properly motivated. Amina turned toward the door, and for a heart-stopping moment, Filiberto thought she might see him. His body tensed, ready to step into the light, but she was already looking down at her phone, checking messages as if she hadn't just shattered a child's world. She walked past them without a glance, her burgundy robe swishing softly against the floor, trailing the faint scent of her expensive perfume. In the room behind her, Leah remained frozen on the bed, too terrified to move even after Amina left. Filiberto stood in the shadows, the recording device heavy in one hand, his weapon untouched beneath his jacket. He'd witnessed the abuse. He'd gathered the evidence. He'd done everything Alessia had asked. But watching his daughter suffer without intervening had cost him something he couldn't name. Some essential piece of his soul had been carved away in that darkness. And now, finally, it was time to make Amina answer for every word. But Alessia's hand on his arm stopped him before he could move. She tilted her head, listening, and he understood immediately. Amina's footsteps hadn't faded down the hallway toward the master bedroom. They'd stopped. A door opened and closed nearby. Not a bedroom. The study, his private office that Amina had commandeered as her own space over the past months. Alessia's eyes met his in the darkness, and she gestured silently. Wait. One more piece. The final evidence they needed. Filiberto's entire body vibrated with the effort of remaining still, but he followed her lead as they moved soundlessly down the corridor. Years of navigating dangerous situations had taught him how to move without sound, how to become a ghost in his own home. They positioned themselves outside the study's door, which Amina had left slightly ajar. Light spilled through the gap, along with her voice, no longer sharp and cruel, but casual, almost cheerful. She was on the phone. Darling, I know it's late, but I had to call you, Amina said, her tone completely transformed. This was the voice she used in public, the charming socialite persona that had fooled everyone, including him. No, Filiberto's not home yet. Another one of his mysterious business trips. She laughed, the sound bright and false. Filiberto's hand found Alessia's in the darkness, and she pressed the recording device into his palm, maneuvering it closer to the door's opening. Every word would be captured now. "Mother, you should have seen her tonight," Amina continued, and there was genuine amusement in her voice now. The little pest was crying again. "Honestly, I don't know how much more of this I can tolerate." A pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "Of course I'm being careful. I never leave marks. I'm not stupid." Another laugh. "It's all psychological. She'll grow up neurotic and damaged, but there will never be proof it was anything more than her own weakness. A sensitive child who couldn't handle the pressure of her father's lifestyle? That's the narrative." Filiberto's free hand clenched into a fist. Hearing her discuss the systematic destruction of his daughter as if it were a strategic plan made his vision blur with rage. "Why don't I just leave?" Amina's voice turned sharp, irritated at the question. "Mother, we've discussed this. The Caruso name opens doors our family has been trying to access for generations. Filiberto's connections, his influence, even his criminal empire, though he won't acknowledge that publicly. These are invaluable assets." She moved around the study, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Through the gap in the door, Filiberto could see her profile, burgundy silk catching the lamplight as she poured herself a drink. "The child is temporary discomfort for permanent gain," Amina said, taking a sip. "Once we're married, once I'm legally Mrs. Caruso, I'll have access to everything." And then, she paused, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. "Then we can discuss arrangements. There are excellent boarding schools in Switzerland. Very expensive, very isolated. She could disappear into one of those for years." Alessia's grip on Filiberto's arm tightened. She could feel the tremors running through him, the barely contained violence threatening to erupt. "Do I love him?" Amina repeated the question and laughed, a cold, crystalline sound devoid of warmth. "Mother, please. I love what he represents. I love the power, the status, the fear in people's eyes when they hear his name. Filiberto himself," she took another drink. "He's a means to an end. A very wealthy, very dangerous means to an end." The casual dismissal of everything he'd thought they shared cut deeper than Filiberto expected. He'd known the relationship was built on mutual benefit, on strategic alliance, rather than romance. But hearing her reduce him to a transaction, a tool to be used, crystallized something in his mind. She'd never seen him as human, just as she'd never seen Leah as a child who deserved protection and love. "The best part is how easy it's been," Amina continued, warming to her subject now. "He's so consumed with his business, so paranoid about keeping his criminal life separate from his home life, that he never looks closely at what's happening right under his nose. I could do anything, and as long as I'm careful about timing, he'd never know." She settled into his leather chair, putting her feet up on the desk with the proprietary ease of someone who already considered everything in this penthouse her own. "The staff?" Terrified into silence. "They know that complaining about me means unemployment at best, or worse if Filiberto decides they're causing problems. I made sure they understood that early on." She examined her manicured nails. "Except that new nurse, Alessia. She's been watching me with those judgmental eyes. I'll need to have her dismissed soon. Can't have anyone developing a conscience." Filiberto felt Alessia stiffen beside him at the mention of her name. Her instincts had been right to act when she did. If she'd waited much longer, Amina would have removed her, and Leah would have lost her only protector. "Of course I've thought about what happens if he finds out," Amina said, responding to something her mother said. "Mother, I've thought about everything. If he discovers the truth about how I treat the child, I have contingencies. His criminal activities are extensively documented, anonymously, of course. One phone call to the right authorities, and Filiberto Caruso would face charges that would destroy him." She smiled, visible through the door's gap, and it was the smile of a predator that believed itself untouchable. He'd lose custody of the girl immediately. I positioned myself as the victim who tried to save the child from her dangerous father. My family's lawyers would ensure I walked away with a substantial settlement, sympathy from the public, and none of the burden of actually raising someone else's offspring. The recording device in Filiberto's hand felt hot now, burning with the weight of her words. Every syllable was captured, preserved, damning. Leverage, mother. It's always about leverage. Amina stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city lights. Filiberto has spent years building power through fear and violence. He never considered that someone might use intelligence and patience to take it all away from him. She paused, listening, then laughed again. Do I feel guilty about the child? About lying to him? Her reflection in the window showed her expression, cold, calculating, completely void of remorse. Mother, guilt is for people who have the luxury of conscience. I want the Caruso Empire, and that little girl is the only obstacle between me and everything I've worked toward. If she needs to suffer for a few years so I can secure my future, that's simply the cost of ambition. Filiberto had heard enough confessions in his life to know when someone was telling their complete truth. This wasn't bravado or exaggeration. This was Amina's actual worldview, laid bare in what she thought was a private conversation with the one person she could be honest with. I should go, Amina said, checking her watch. Filiberto will be home soon, and I need to be the perfect, caring fiancé when he arrives. The role I play so well. She smiled at her own reflection. Don't worry, mother. Everything is proceeding exactly according to plan. Within 6 months, I'll be Mrs. Caruso. Within a year, the child will be someone else's problem. And within 2 years, I'll control everything. She ended the call, set down her glass, and stood for a moment, surveying the study with the satisfaction of someone already mentally redecorating. Then she walked toward the door. Filiberto and Alessia pressed back into the shadows as Amina emerged, still smiling to herself, completely unaware that every word of her confession had been recorded. She moved down the hallway toward the master bedroom, already reaching up to take down her hair, preparing for the performance of concerned fiancé she'd deliver when he returned home. In the darkness, Alessia carefully secured the recording device, checking that everything had been captured properly. She looked up at Filiberto, and in the dim light, he could see the grim satisfaction in her expression. They had it. All of it. Not just the abuse of Leah, but Amina's complete motivations, her contingency plans, her threats against him, her dismissal of his daughter as an obstacle to be removed. Evidence that would destroy her utterly. Filiberto's hand moved to his weapon one final time, but this time it wasn't impulse. It was conscious choice. He could end this with violence, quick and final. Or he could end it with something more devastating. The complete dismantling of everything Amina had schemed to achieve. Alessia seemed to read his thoughts. She nodded once, then whispered, now. Finish this now. And Filiberto stepped out of the shadows, no longer hiding, no longer waiting. The confrontation had arrived. He moved with the deliberate precision of a predator that had finally decided to strike. His footsteps were measured, unhurried, each one echoing through the hallway with the weight of inevitability. Filiberto Caruso had spent years cultivating a presence that made men instinctively step back, that made rooms fall silent when he entered. Now, in his own home, he let that full power radiate without restraint. The master bedroom door was ajar. Through it, he could see Amina at her vanity, removing her jewelry with the casual ease of someone who believed herself completely safe. She hummed softly, actually hummed, as she unfastened her necklace. Filiberto stopped in the doorway, his frame filling it completely. 6 feet of controlled violence, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light. His hands hung loose at his sides, but there was nothing relaxed about his posture. He was a coiled spring, a loaded weapon, death wearing an expensive suit. He said nothing, just stood there, watching her. It took her nearly 30 seconds to notice him in the mirror's reflection. When she did, her first reaction was a smile, the warm, welcoming expression she'd perfected for him. Darling, you're home early. I thought. The words died as she turned and actually looked at him. Whatever she saw on his face made her smile falter. The jewelry slipped from her fingers, clattering against the vanity's marble surface. She stood slowly, smoothing down her burgundy robe with hands that had just begun to tremble. Filiberto! Her voice carried a question, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. Is something wrong? He still didn't speak, just watched her with eyes that had gone cold and flat, the way they looked when he was deciding whether someone lived or died. In the low lamplight, his face could have been carved from stone, beautiful and absolutely merciless. The silence stretched between them like a blade. Amina's performance instincts kicked in. She moved toward him, concern painting her features. You're frightening me. Has something happened? Is it business? Talk to me. She reached out to touch his arm. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but something in his absolute stillness made her hand freeze inches from contact. Some primal part of her brain recognized danger when it stood this close. Filiberto, please. You're scaring me. What? How long? His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, but it cut through her words like a knife through silk. How long have you been terrorizing my daughter? Every drop of color drained from Amina's face. What? I don't. Who told you? She was scrambling now. He could see it in her eyes. The calculations running behind her gaze, trying to determine what he knew, how much damage control was needed. Filiberto, if someone has been telling you lies about me. How long? The two words carried enough weight to make her step back. I haven't, she started, then seemed to make a decision. Her expression shifted to wounded innocence. Is this about tonight? I was simply trying to help Leah understand boundaries. She can be difficult, darling. You know that. I was firm with her, yes, but only because you're not here to provide discipline yourself. Someone has to. Alessia? Filiberto called out, not taking his eyes off Amina. Come in here, please. The nurse appeared in the doorway, the recording device in her hand. Her presence seemed to physically wound Amina, whose eyes widened with recognition and rage. You, Amina hissed. You've been spying on me, turning him against me with your lies. Lies. Filiberto's voice remained soft, but something in it made Amina's mouth snap shut. Is that what we're calling it? He took the device from Alessia's hand, his movements deliberate, giving Amina time to understand what he held. Time to feel the first tendrils of real fear. I'm going to play something for you, he said, his thumb hovering over the playback button. And I want you to understand that I've already heard it. I know everything. So when it's finished, when you try to explain or justify or manipulate your way out of this, remember that I already know you're lying. Filiberto, please. He pressed play. His daughter's voice filled the room, small and terrified. Please, I'll be good. I promise I'll be quieter. Then Amina's own voice, sharp and cruel. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to play mother to some man's orphan baggage? Amina lunged for the device, but Filiberto simply raised it above her reach, his other hand catching her wrist with enough pressure to stop her movement completely. He held her there, forcing her to listen to her own words. You're nothing but an obstacle, a constant reminder that he had a life before me. Amina's face contorted, rage, fear, desperation cycling through her features. Turn it off. Turn it off right now. But Filiberto held her wrist steady and let the recording play. Her voice, telling Leah she was pathetic, weak, a burden. Every poisonous word she'd spoken captured and preserved. When he finally released her wrist, Amina stumbled back, her composure cracking. You don't understand. She needed to learn. He skipped forward in the recording. Now, it was her phone conversation, her voice bright and casual as she spoke to her mother. The child is temporary discomfort for permanent gain. Amina's eyes went wide with horror. Once we're married, once I'm legally Mrs. Caruso, I'll have access to everything. She shook her head, backing away from him. You're taking it out of context. Do I love him? Mother, please. I love what he represents. The words hung in the air between them. Filiberto watched her with those cold, intense eyes, cataloging every micro-expression as her carefully constructed world collapsed. Filiberto himself? He's a means to an end. Amina opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. What could she possibly say? The evidence was irrefutable, her own voice condemning her absolutely. I can explain, she finally managed, but even she didn't sound convinced. Filiberto turned off the recording. The silence that followed was more damning than any of the words that had preceded it. You systematically abused my daughter, he said, his voice still soft, still controlled. You planned to ship her away to boarding school. You documented my business activities to use as leverage against me. You came into my home, into my life, with the sole intention of taking everything and discarding anyone who stood in your way. Each statement was delivered without emotion, just cold fact. Amina's survival instincts finally kicked improperly. She dropped to her knees, tears springing to her eyes with remarkable speed. Please, Filiberto, I was wrong. I was so wrong. But I can change. We can work through this. I'll apologize to Leah. I'll be better, I swear. Stand up. The command froze her mid-plea. I said stand up. There was no room for negotiation in his tone. She rose shakily, mascara beginning to streak down her face. The beautiful, composed socialite was gone, replaced by someone who'd just realized they'd miscalculated catastrophically. Filiberto pulled out his phone, never breaking eye contact with her. He pressed a single contact, held the phone to his ear. Marco, he said when someone answered. I need a removal. Immediate. Permanent. A pause. Yes. The penthouse. Send a team. Amina's face went white as paper. What does that mean? Filiberto, what are you doing? He ended the call, pocketing the phone. You wanted the Caruso name. You wanted the power that comes with it. You wanted to know what it means to be part of my world. His eyes had never been colder. Now you're going to learn exactly what happens to people who threaten what's mine. You can't. Her voice climbed toward hysteria. My family will. Your family will receive a very simple message. He moved closer, his presence overwhelming in its intensity. You left in the middle of the night. You're gone. And if they ask questions, if they make problems, if they breathe wrong in my direction, they'll learn very quickly why people fear the Caruso name. Please. The word broke on a sob. Please, I'll leave. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. Just let me go. No. The single word was final, absolute. You were right about one thing, Amina. I am dangerous. I am ruthless. And when someone hurts what I love, I don't give them the opportunity to do it twice. Footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of his men. 3 of them, loyal soldiers who'd served him for years, who knew exactly what permanent removal meant. Amina turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. Marco, his most trusted enforcer, filled the doorway. No marks, Filiberto said quietly. And make sure she understands completely why this is happening before the end. Amina's scream was cut short as Marco moved forward. Filiberto turned away, unable to watch any longer, unwilling to witness what he'd set in motion. Alessia stood in the hallway, her face pale but resolute. She understood what was happening, understood the terrible finality of it. As his men escorted Amina from the penthouse, her protests fading down the hallway, Filiberto stood in the silence that followed, the recording device still in his hand. He'd done what needed to be done. Amina would never hurt Leah again. She'd never hurt anyone again. But the weight of that choice, of that order, settled over him like a shroud. This was who he was, who he'd always been, and it was exactly what needed to change. But change required more than recognition. It required action, immediate and uncompromising. Filiberto stood in the now empty master bedroom, the echo of Amina's final screams still resonating in the silence. The recording device sat on the dresser where he'd placed it, evidence he would never need again, but couldn't quite bring himself to destroy. Not yet. Alessia remained in the doorway, her face unreadable. She'd witnessed everything, understood exactly what permanent removal meant in his world. Yet she hadn't fled, hadn't condemned him. She simply waited. Gather the staff, he said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd aged years in a single night. Everyone who works in this house. I want them in the main living area in 10 minutes. She nodded once and disappeared down the hallway. Filiberto, moved to check on Leah first. His daughter had finally cried herself into fitful sleep, her small body curled around a stuffed bear, face still wet with tears. He stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, feeling the weight of every failure pressed down on his shoulders. He'd removed the threat, but he couldn't erase the damage. Not yet, anyway, but he could make sure it never happened again. The living room felt different when he entered it, colder, more cavernous than he remembered. Or perhaps he was simply seeing it clearly for the first time. This penthouse, with its expensive furnishings and commanding views, had been a fortress, a symbol of his power and success. It had also been a prison for his daughter. The staff assembled quickly, sensing the gravity in Alessia's summons. 7 of them in total: the housekeeper, 2 maids, the cook, the driver, the butler, and the evening security guard who monitored the private elevator. They stood in an uncertain cluster, exchanging nervous glances. They knew something had happened. The penthouse's atmosphere had shifted, charged with the same dangerous energy that preceded violence in Filiberto's world. He let them wait in silence for a full minute, studying each face. Some couldn't meet his eyes. Others tried to maintain professional composure, but failed, their fear evident in the tension of their shoulders, the way they shifted their weight. They knew. They'd all known. How long? His voice cut through the silence like a blade. How long have you known that Amina was abusing my daughter? The housekeeper, a woman named Maria who'd worked for him for 3 years, opened her mouth and closed it again. The driver stared at his shoes. One of the maids began to cry, silently. I asked you a question. Filiberto's tone didn't rise, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. How long? 6 months, Maria finally whispered. Maybe longer. We heard things, saw things, and none of you thought to inform me. Mr. Caruso, the butler started, but Filiberto silenced him with a look. You were afraid, Filiberto said, and it wasn't a question. Afraid of Amina. Afraid of losing your positions. Afraid of me. He moved through the room, his presence making each of them flinch. So you remained silent while a 6-year-old child was terrorized in her own home. We didn't know what to do, one of the maids said, tears streaming down her face. Miss Amina said if we caused problems, if we went to you with complaints. She threatened you, Filiberto finished. Yes, I understand. And you chose your jobs over my daughter's well-being. The accusation hung in the air, irrefutable. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, and some of the tension eased fractionally. But you're all fired, effective immediately. You'll each receive 3-month severance and excellent references, on the condition that you never speak of what happened in this house. Not to anyone. Ever. Maria's face crumpled. Mr. Caruso, please. I have children of my own to support. Then you should understand better than anyone why you failed mine. His voice remained level, but the words cut deep. I pay you generously. I provide benefits, security, stability. And in return, the only thing I truly required was that you protect what matters to me. You didn't. The security guard stepped forward, his jaw set. With respect, sir, we were caught between you and Miss Amina. You were never here. She was. What were we supposed to do? The challenge in his voice would have normally earned a harsh response. Instead, Filiberto simply nodded. You're right, he said, and surprise rippled through the group. I wasn't here. I failed first, and I failed worst. But your failure doesn't erase yours. You had choices. You chose wrong. He pulled out his phone, made a quick call to his accountant. Draw up severance packages for 7 employees. 3 months, full benefits continuation, references upon request. Have the paperwork ready by morning. He ended the call and looked back at his former staff. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and leave. The severance will be transferred by tomorrow afternoon. Mr. Caruso, Maria tried again, but he shook his head. 1 hour. Marco will oversee your departure. His most trusted enforcer had returned from removing Amina and now stood near the elevator, his presence ensuring compliance. I suggest you use the time wisely. They filed out slowly, some crying, others angry, all of them understanding that arguing would be futile. Filiberto Caruso had made his decision, and it was final. Within minutes, the penthouse was filled with the sounds of hurried packing, quiet sobbing, whispered conversations. Filiberto stood at the window, watching the city lights blur and refocus, feeling the weight of the night's actions settle into his bones. Alessia approached quietly, stopping a respectful distance away. That was harsh. It was necessary. Yes, she agreed. It was. He turned to face her. This woman who'd been in his home for barely 6 weeks, but had shown more loyalty, more courage, more genuine care for his daughter than anyone he'd known for years. Why, he asked. Why did you risk everything? You could have left, found another position, stayed silent like everyone else. Alessia met his eyes directly. Because I've seen what silence does. I've watched children suffer while adults look away, telling themselves it's not their business, not their responsibility. I swore I would never be that person again. Again. Her expression tightened. I had a younger sister once. She died because no one spoke up when they should have. Because everyone was too afraid, too concerned with their own lives to protect a child who needed protection. She paused, old pain flickering across her face. I can't bring her back, but I could save Leah. The confession explained everything. Her fierce protectiveness, her willingness to document and risk, her refusal to accept payment. This wasn't about money or loyalty to him. This was about redemption for a failure she still carried. Filiberto understood that burden intimately now. Thank you, he said, and the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what she'd done. You saved my daughter's life. Perhaps not literally, but you saved who she could become. That debt, I can never repay it. I don't want repayment, Alessia said quietly. I want you to be the father she needs. That's all. I will be. The promise felt like an oath, binding and absolute. But I also want you to stay. Not as temporary help, not as a nurse. As Lee's caregiver. Permanent. Trusted. With full authority over her well-being and whatever resources you need. Alessia studied him carefully. Can you keep that promise? Can you really change? It was the question he'd been asking himself all night. Could a man built on violence and absence transform into someone present and protective? Could he shed the skin of who he'd been and become someone worthy of his daughter's trust? I don't know, he admitted, the honesty costing him. But I'm going to try. And I need someone who will hold me accountable. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm failing again. A small smile touched Alessia's lips. I can do that. I'm counting on it. The sounds of the staff's departure had faded. The penthouse was falling silent, emptying of everyone except the 3 people who truly mattered. Himself, Alessia, and his sleeping daughter. We'll need to hire new staff, Alessia said, practical as always. People who understand that Lee's well-being is the priority. People who will speak up if something's wrong. I'll leave that to you. Choose carefully. Pay whatever's necessary to get the right people. He looked back at the window, at the empire he'd built spread out below him. Everything changes now. This house, my schedule, my priorities, all of it. Good, Alessia said simply. They stood together in the silence of the cleansed house. 2 people who'd witnessed the worst of what could happen when power wasn't tempered by presence, when fear replaced conscience. The night had been brutal, necessary, devastating, but it was also the beginning of something different, something that might eventually resemble redemption. The house had fallen into complete silence by the time Filiberto approached his daughter's room again. 3 a.m. The city beyond the windows had quieted to a low hum, the usual symphony of traffic and sirens reduced to occasional whispers. The penthouse felt different now. Emptier, yes, but also somehow cleaner. As if the removal of Amina and the complicit staff had purged something toxic from the air itself. Lee's door was still ajar, exactly as he'd left it. Soft amber light from her night light spilled into the hallway, a gentle beacon in the darkness. He'd passed this door countless times over the years, always moving towards something else, a meeting, a call, another crisis that demanded his attention. Tonight, he stopped. Tonight, he entered. Leo was still curled in the same position, her small body tucked into a defensive ball, her stuffed bear clutched her chest like a shield. Her face, even in sleep, carried traces of distress. The slight furrow between her brows, the way her lips trembled occasionally as if she were still pleading in her dreams. Filiberto moved silently to her bedside and lowered himself to sit on the edge, his considerable weight barely depressing the mattress. Up close, he could see the tear tracks dried on her cheeks, the redness around her eyes, the way her fingers gripped the bear with desperate intensity. She looked so small. Had she always been this small? Of course she had. She was 6, but somewhere in his mind, he'd constructed an image of her as more capable, more resilient than this fragile reality. He needed to believe she was fine so he could justify his absence. Self-deception masquerading as faith in her strength. "Leah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Bambina." She stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Her breathing hitched, and for a moment he thought she might cry out again, but she simply burrowed deeper into her pillow. Filiberto reached out slowly, his hand, a hand that had held weapons, signed death warrants, broken bones, hovering over her small shoulder. When he finally made contact, his touch was feather-light, terrified of causing more harm. "Papa's here," he murmured. "I'm here now." Lee's eyes fluttered open slowly, unfocused with sleep and confusion. She blinked several times, and when recognition dawned, her first instinct was fear. She flinched. That small movement, that instinctive recoil from her own father, nearly broke him. "It's okay," he said quickly, keeping his voice soft, his movements minimal. "You're safe. I promise you're safe." Leah stared at him, her eyes still wide and uncertain. "Papa." Her voice was hoarse from crying. Is she gone?" The single word carried the weight of absolute finality. "Amina is gone. She will never come back. She will never hurt you again." Something in his tone must have convinced her of the truth, because her small body began to tremble. Not with fear this time, but with the release of tension that had been building for months. The dam that had held back everything finally cracked. "I try to be good," she whispered, tears spilling fresh down her cheeks. "I tried so hard, Papa. I was quiet. I didn't ask for things. I stayed in my room." "I know." His own voice cracked. "I know you did, Bambina. And none of it was your fault. None of it. She said you didn't want me. She said I was a gift." Filiberto moved closer, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she needed to. "You were a gift, the most precious thing in my life. And I failed you by not being here to protect you from someone who was too broken to see how extraordinary you are." Lee's tears came faster now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. She reached for him, tentatively at first, as if expecting rejection, and when he opened his arms, she launched herself into them with desperate need. Filiberto caught her carefully, wrapping his arms around her small body and pulling her against his chest. The contrast was stark. His imposing frame, built for violence and intimidation, cradling the tiny, fragile child who fit against him like she was made to be there. His daughter, his responsibility, his greatest failure and his last chance at redemption. "I'm sorry," he said in her hair, the words inadequate but necessary. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I didn't see. I'm sorry I let this happen to you." Leah clung to him, her fingers gripping his shirt with surprising strength. "Don't leave again," she sobbed. "Please don't leave again." The plea cut deeper than any blade ever had. "I won't," he promised, and felt the weight of that vow settle into his bones. "Everything changes now, Leah. Everything." He held her while she cried, absorbing months of suppressed fear and pain and loneliness. She cried until she hiccuped, until her body had exhausted itself, until she was boneless against him, held up only by his arms. When she finally quieted, her voice came out small and fragile. "Promise. I promise. But you have to work. You're always working." Filiberto closed his eyes, feeling the truth of her words like physical blows. His empire, his operations, his carefully constructed criminal network that demanded constant attention, constant presence, constant willingness to make brutal decisions. The life he built had cost him everything that actually mattered. "Do you know what I do for work, Bambina?" he asked quietly. Leah shook her head against his chest. You said it was complicated, that I'd understand when I was older. I'm going to tell you the truth now. Not all of it. You're too young for all of it, but the important part. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. I do things that are sometimes dangerous, sometimes not good. I've told myself they were necessary, that they protected you and provided for you. But tonight, I realized something. He pulled back slightly so he could see her face so she could see his. I realized that all the power in the world doesn't mean anything if you're not here to see it, if you're not safe and happy and loved. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I'm going to stop, Leah. I'm going to close that chapter of my life and be the father you deserve. The father I should have been all along. Lee's eyes were wide, processing words that were perhaps too big for her age, but understanding the emotion behind them. You mean you'll be home? I'll be home. Every night. Every night. And no more, Mina. Never again. Something like hope flickered across her tear-stained face. And you'll read me stories? And help with homework? And have breakfast with me? Each question was a small indictment of his absence, a reminder of all the ordinary moments he'd missed while building his empire of blood and fear. Yes, he said, his throat tight. All of that and more. We'll have breakfast together every morning. I'll read to you every night. I'll be here for homework and bad dreams and everything in between. What about the scary meetings? He understood what she meant. The times men in dark suits had come to the penthouse, when voices were raised and she'd hidden in her room. All the times his work had bled into their home. No more, he said firmly. This house is yours, Bambina. Only yours. My work, what's left of it, will stay somewhere else. Here, there will only be us. You, me, and Alessia. Alessia's staying? A note of relief entered her voice. She's staying. She's going to help take care of you, and she's going to make sure I keep my promises. Leah considered this, her young mind working through the enormity of the changes being offered. Then, with the brutal honesty of children, she asked, but what if you forget? What if your work becomes important again? The question hit its mark. How many times had he promised himself he'd spend more time with her? How many times had he meant it, genuinely, only to be pulled back into his empire's demands? But this time was different. This time, he'd seen the cost of his absence written in his daughter's tears. This time, he'd heard her voice breaking as she begged someone to love her. This time, he understood that no amount of power or wealth or fear could substitute for presence. Then you remind me, he said, meeting her eyes with complete seriousness. If I start to forget, if I start to slip back into old ways, you tell me, and I will listen. That's my vow to you, Leah. Not just that I'll be here, but that I'll listen when you need me to hear you. She studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to determine if they could trust a promise that had been broken before. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly and tucked herself back against his chest. Okay, Papa. Filiberto held her close, feeling her small heart beating against his, and made a silent vow to whatever forces might be listening. He would dismantle his empire. He would close the illegal operations, liquidate the dangerous assets, sever the connections that had defined his adult life. It wouldn't be quick or easy. You didn't simply walk away from his kind of power, but he would do it methodically, carefully, ensuring no blowback touched his daughter. And once he'd extracted himself from that world, he would learn how to be someone different, someone whose power came not from fear, but from presence, someone whose legacy wasn't measured in territory controlled, but in moments shared with his child. The man who'd ordered permanent removal just hours ago would have to coexist with a father who now held his daughter while she finally felt safe enough to sleep. It was a contradiction he'd have to navigate, a balance between the violence he'd committed and the gentleness he needed to cultivate. But as Lee's breathing deepened and evened, as she relaxed fully in his arms for perhaps the first time in months, Filiberto understood that this was worth any cost. His empire could fall. His daughter would not. 6 weeks had passed since that night, and the transformation was both profound and subtle. Filiberto woke to sunlight streaming through curtains he'd actually opened the night before, something he'd never bothered with when the penthouse had been merely a place to sleep between crises. Now, He liked the way morning light painted Lee's artwork on the refrigerator, the way it caught the dust motes dancing above the breakfast table where his daughter sat doing homework. "Papa, how do you spell necessary?" Leah asked, not looking up from her workbook, her pencil poised in concentration. "Necessary," he said, pouring coffee and orange juice simultaneously, a domestic multitasking skill he'd never imagined possessing. One collar, two sleeves. What? Old memory trick. One C, two S's. He set the juice in front of her and dropped a kiss on top of her head, an action that had become natural over the past weeks. "What's the assignment?" "Vocabulary sentences." She wrinkled her nose. "I have to use each word correctly. Want help?" She considered, then shook her head. "I want to try first. But will you check them when I'm done?" Of course. This was their routine now. Breakfast together at 7. Homework review, school drop-off that he handled himself most mornings. The drive had become sacred time. 20 minutes where she'd tell him about her friends, her worries, her small triumphs. 20 minutes where he learned how to simply listen without trying to solve, fix, or control. Alessia emerged from the hallway, dressed professionally but comfortably, her presence a constant that had become essential to their household's rhythm. She'd transformed from temporary nurse to trusted family in ways that had surprised them all. "Morning," she said, helping herself to coffee. "Leah, did you finish packing your library books? They're due today." "Oh." Leah jumped up, nearly knocking over her juice. "I forgot. In your room, on the desk where you left them yesterday," Alessia said with a knowing smile. Leah dashed off, and Filiberto caught Alessia's eye across the kitchen. They shared a look of amused understanding, the kind that came from weeks of navigating a child's chaos together. "Thank you," he said quietly. She'd have remembered eventually. "I meant for everything, but also for that." Alessia's expression softened. "She's doing better. The nightmares are less frequent." They were. 2 weeks ago, Leah had slept through the entire night for the first time since Amina's removal. Filiberto had checked on her 3 times that night, terrified something was wrong, before accepting that peace could look like uninterrupted sleep. "Dr. Morrison says she's making good progress," Alessia continued, referencing the child psychologist they'd started seeing twice a week. "Building trust takes time, but she's getting there." Filiberto nodded, swallowing against the familiar guilt. The therapist had explained that healing from psychological abuse was a marathon, not a sprint. Some days Leah was bright and energetic, laughing at his terrible jokes. Other days she was withdrawn, testing boundaries to see if he'd really stay. He stayed every time. The penthouse itself had changed. Where it had once been a showpiece of wealth and power, all sharp edges and expensive art chosen by designers, it now bore the marks of actual living. Lee's drawings covered the previously pristine refrigerator. Her books overflowed from the new shelves they'd installed together. Her laughter echoed in rooms that had been silent for too long. The office where Amina had made her damning phone call had been completely redone. Now it was a combination playroom and study space, painted in soft colors Leah had chosen herself. His actual business work, the legitimate operations he was transitioning toward, was conducted from a separate office downtown. The criminal empire was being systematically dismantled. It was delicate, dangerous work. You didn't just resign from his former life. But he'd been careful, methodical, using the same strategic mind that had built the empire to now disassemble it. Territory was transferred to trusted lieutenants. Operations were liquidated or legitimized. Debts were settled. Alliances were carefully severed. There had been pushback, threats, 2 attempts at retaliation that his remaining security had neutralized. But he'd made his position clear. Touch his daughter, threaten his home, and there would be consequences that transcended business. The message had been received. Marco, his most loyal enforcer, had been the hardest conversation. The man had served him for 15 years, had executed orders without question, had protected him through countless conflicts. "You're really walking away?" Marco had asked, disbelief and something like betrayal in his voice. "I'm choosing something different," Filiberto had replied. "You can come with me. There's legitimate work if you want it. Or I'll set you up with territory, connections, Everything you need to succeed without me. But I'm done with that life. Marco had studied him for a long moment. It's the kid, isn't it? It's always been the kid. I was just too blind to see it. In the end, Marco had chosen to take the territory, but their parting had been respectful. Another thread cut, another tie to his former life severed. Leah bounded back into the kitchen. Library books clutched her chest. Got them. Good. Finish your breakfast and we'll head out in 15 minutes, Filiberto said, checking his watch. His morning was clear until 10. A breakfast meeting with potential investors for his new legitimate import company. Boring, legal, and exactly what he needed. Papa. Lee's voice was tentative. Can Alessia come to the school play next week? I'm a tree in the forest scene. Filiberto looked at Alessia, who'd paused mid-sip of her coffee. In her eyes, he saw the same surprise and emotion he felt. This was new. Leah actively wanting to include Alessia in her life, claiming her as family. Of course she can, he said. If Alessia wants to watch you be the best tree in theatrical history. Alessia's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes. I wouldn't miss it. Leah beamed and returned to her breakfast, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. But its significance lingered. This was what healing looked like, small moments of trust, tiny expansions of their family circle. Later, after school drop-off, Filiberto returned to find Alessia reorganizing Lee's closet, sorting through clothes that no longer fit. You don't have to do that, he said from the doorway. I can hire someone. I want to. Alessia interrupted gently. This isn't work, Filiberto. This is. She paused, searching for the right word. This is family. The statement hung between them, profound in its simplicity. She was right. Somewhere in the crisis and its aftermath, they'd become something more than employer and employee. They were co-parents, partners in Lee's healing, bound by shared trauma and shared purpose. You know, he said quietly, that night, when you stopped me from killing her immediately, I hated you for it. In that moment, I wanted to tear the world apart. I know, but you were right. Not just tactically, but morally. You forced me to think beyond my instincts, to consider consequences I'd spent years ignoring. He leaned against the doorframe. You saved more than Leah that night. You might have saved me too. Alessia set down the clothes she'd been folding and turned to face him fully. You save yourself. I just gave you the space to do it. We make a good team. We do. The conversation was interrupted by Filiberto's phone. A call from his lawyer about the final dissolution of one of his former operations. Business that would once have consumed his entire day, but now took 15 minutes to resolve. When he hung up, he found Alessia watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? You're different, she said. Not just with Leah. You're lighter. Like you've been carrying weight for so long that you'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. He considered this, testing the truth of it. She was right. The constant vigilance, the endless calculations of threat and opportunity, the weight of maintaining power through fear, all of it had been a burden he'd grown so accustomed to that he'd stopped noticing. Now, stripped of his empire and focused on the simple complexity of being present for his daughter, he felt simultaneously more vulnerable and more powerful than he'd ever been. I spent 20 years building something I thought mattered, he said finally. Turns out I was building the wrong thing. Not wrong, just incomplete. Alessia moved to the window, looking out at the city. You built power. Now you're building something more difficult, peace. That evening, after dinner and homework and the nightly reading ritual, Filiberto stood in Lee's doorway watching her sleep. It had become his habit, this final check before his own rest, ensuring she was safe, peaceful, healing. Alessia appeared beside him, her presence companionable in the quiet. She smiled today, Alessia whispered. A real smile. Not forced, not tentative. Just pure happiness when she was playing at recess. I saw it too. At breakfast, when I made that terrible pun about the orange juice. They stood together in the comfortable silence of people who'd weathered something devastating and emerged changed. The bond forged in crisis had transformed into something more enduring, a shared commitment to this child, to this home, to this new life they were building from the ashes of the old. Do you miss it? Alessia asked. The power. The empire. Filiberto thought about it honestly. Did he miss the fear in people's eyes? The weight of absolute control? The rush of strategic victories? Sometimes, he admitted, but then she calls me Papa, or she asks me to check her homework, or she reaches for my hand without thinking about it. He trailed off, the comparison making his answer obvious. His empire had made him feared. His daughter made him necessary. And that was a power no criminal enterprise could ever match. Good answer, Alessia said softly, and in the dim hallway light, he caught her smile. They stood watched together for a moment longer, two unlikely guardians who'd found their purpose in protecting one small life. Then they turned away, leaving Leah to her peaceful dreams while they retreated to their own rest. The penthouse was no longer a fortress. It was home, and Filiberto Caruso, former crime lord, discovered that choosing family over empire wasn't weakness. It was the only strength that truly mattered.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.